The Caribbean air was heavy, humid, saturated with the scents of night flowers and the brackish breath of the ocean, which spread beyond the wide panoramic windows leading to a private beach. I stood in the center of the huge hall, where polished marble tiles reflected the light of crystal chandeliers, and looked at two people whose contempt for me was as obvious as their amazement at what was happening. "Only those of noble birth can stay in this house," my mother-in-law's voice, cold as a silver spoon in a glass of champagne, hung in the air, poisoning it with invisible drops of poison. I watched as her perfectly toned face contorted into that familiar grin that I had to endure for the past 5 years. Her every look, every word, every barely noticeable grimace were like sharpened knives, skillfully plunged into the skin, leaving no visible wounds, but causing pain that accumulates over the years. Gaspard, my husband, didn't say a word. He just nodded in agreement, and his expression mirrored the contempt his mother had for me since childhood. "Honey, I think it would be better if you left," he finally said, not even bothering to meet my eyes. I felt something new ignite inside me, something deeper and stronger than the usual pain and shame that accompanied their constant humiliation. It was something else, an unbearable, all-consuming rage, but not one that blinds and pushes to reckless acts, but one that clears the mind, makes it cold, calculating, ruthless. It was with this fury that I smiled, turning to the guard standing at the massive carved doors with the haughty bearing of a man accustomed to seeing many scenes of rich family squabbles. "Could you escort them from my resort area?" The look of shock on their faces was priceless. Gaspard froze, his lips parted, but no sound escaped them. His mother's forehead, which seemed to be an eternal monument of perfect smoothness thanks to constant injections of Botox, even managed to wrinkle. Their eyes darted to the elegant brass plaque mounted on the wall behind me. The plaque with my name on it in gold letters. Families. The very name that adorned every building in this luxurious resort complex. This can't be possible." My mother-in-law stammered, her perfectly manicured hand clutching the pearl necklace as if it could shield her from reality. You're just a girl from a small town in Minnesota." "A small town girl whose father was a carpenter," I agreed, taking a long pause, enjoying their amazement. "A carpenter who invested wisely and built an empire." Gaspard looked at me as if he had never seen me before. But he never tried to look deeper, to understand who I really was. All he saw was a convenient picture created by his mother, a picture he wanted to believe in because it was easier that way. "Have you ever wondered why I insisted on holding the wedding here?" I continued, turning to my mother-in-law. "I wanted to give you a chance to see me for who I am, not who you want me to be." The guard stepped forward, professional, polite, ready to fulfill my request. Gaspard automatically reached for my hand, as if trying to hold on to something that had already irretrievably slipped away. I stepped back. Without further ado, she took off her wedding ring, and it fell to the marble floor with a melodious tinkle, becoming the last chord in this long symphony of lies and pretense. "As for the grand wedding you were planning for your son and his new girlfriend." My smile widened, almost friendly. "I have something special about this." I watched as their expressions changed, anger, surprise, alarm. Looking back, I realized that there were always signs. Secret phone calls. Late nights at the office. A subtle change in Gaspard's demeanor. I didn't see them because I didn't want to see them. I was too busy running my family's business, the secret empire created by my father, to imagine that my own family was making plans behind my back. But now everything has fallen into place. Today, standing in the lobby of my flagship resort, I finally realized that there are people who will never change, no matter how many chances you give them. The only question worth asking myself was, why did I take so long to change for them? At that moment, my phone vibrated. The message from my assistant was concise but filled with meaning. "Everything is ready." They had no idea what they had just set in motion. Gaspard and his mother, who aspired to an ideal world of social ascent, impeccable status, and false pretenses, had to see this world crumble. and I was going to watch it in all its glory. But first I had to take the first step. The truth I was about to reveal should have shaken them to their core. The carpenter's daughter, whom they looked down on, was going to teach them a lesson in true class. And the wedding, which they had planned so carefully, would actually take place. Just not in the way they expected. I had something much more interesting in store for their perfect day. I stood at the window of my office in the penthouse, watching as Gaspard and his mother left the resort, accompanied by guards, their backs tense, their steps quick and sharp, as if they were trying to escape humiliation, but in vain. It had already seized them with a death grip, spreading through their veins, burning pride and leaving behind I feel only furious, helpless indignation. 5 years. For 5 years, I pretended that their disregard for me was nothing more than an annoying misunderstanding, that over time they would see in me not just a girl from Minnesota, but an equal, that love, real, sincere, could melt the ice of age-old prejudices and arrogance. I believed that if I was patient enough, gentle enough, restrained enough, they would eventually accept me for who I am. What a fool I was. My father's words echoed in my head, his voice firm, confident, filled with the very determination that allowed him to build an empire. Never let anyone make you feel insignificant, Mimi. We are building not only resorts, but also the future. He started with a small carpentry business, investing not only money but also his soul in it, and turned it into one of the most successful hotel chains in the world, guided not only by calculation, but also by vision. And when he died 3 years ago, I got not just a legacy, but a responsibility to continue his work, protect his reputation, and protect his name. The day I met Gaspard at a charity event, it seemed to me that I had found a man who finally saw me not through the prism of money and power, but for who I really am. He was charming, attentive, seemed sincere. He listened to my thoughts, was interested in my dreams, or at least he knew how to pretend to be interested. I didn't tell him about my family's business. I wanted him to love me for me, not for my bank account. What an irony. The sound of footsteps snapped me out of my thoughts. Sarah, my assistant, appeared in the doorway, clutching several thin folders in her hands. "I have the files you asked for," she said softly, but there was a hidden tension in her voice. I nodded, turning away from the window and walking over to my desk, gathering my thoughts before opening the folders. "Show me." Sarah spread out the papers in front of me, and I slowly began to study them. Photo. Decryption of emails. Bank statements. Everything carefully documented Gaspard's betrayal, his months-long affair with Justina, the very woman his mother would have chosen as her daughter-in-law if she had a choice. Their secret affair lasted 8 months. 8 months of lying, cheating. The wedding they were planning behind my back was supposed to take place next spring at this very resort. "They've already made deposits under different names," Sarah explained, pointing to a number of transactions. "Mrs. Lancaster has been working with her personal wedding planner for several weeks." I couldn't help but let out a short, bitter laugh. What an impertinence. My mother-in-law has always been cunning, but this time her intrigues would turn against her. "Have you contacted our lawyers?" "Yes," Sarah nodded, but hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Considering the prenup and the infidelity clause, everything is on our side." "But—" I could hear the doubt in her voice. Sarah sighed. "But they plan to challenge your rights to the resort chain." I froze, looking at her, feeling something cold and heavy sinking into my stomach. "Mrs. Lancaster has been collecting, as she claims, evidence that your father's initial investments came from questionable sources." My blood froze in my veins. Sure. Now everything has fallen into place. This explained the recent invasion of our old family home, the mysterious questions about my father's first partners, and the sudden media interest in his early years in business. They didn't just plan to get rid of me, they wanted to destroy everything he had built, erase his name from history, and ruin his reputation. I went to the wall behind which, hidden behind the painting, there was a small safe, dialed the code and opened it, taking out a worn leather magazine. His father guided him from the very beginning of his journey, recording in it every transaction, every investment, every step towards creating his empire. He knew that someday someone might question his honesty, and he was ready for it. I ran my fingers over his familiar handwriting, inhaling the scent of old leather and paper. Sarah, call Michael. A journalist? I nodded. When the time comes, they will get their interview. The world needs to know the truth about how a carpenter built one of the most successful hotel chains in the Caribbean. I stopped, thinking for a moment. I needed to find out everything I could about Ricardo's family. My gut told me that Gaspard and his mother weren't the only ones with secrets to hide. After Sarah left, I sat at the table for a long time, flipping through the pages of my father's diary, feeling my resolve grow inside me. I've been silent about my true identity for so long, believing that it's the right thing to do, that money and power shouldn't define a person, that my past and my roots don't matter, that if I just behave with restraint and humility, their attitude towards me will change. Now I get it. My silence only allowed them to consider themselves right. My phone vibrated when I received a message from Gaspard. We need to talk. It's not what you think. Oh, but it was exactly what I thought. And while he and his mother were planning their next move, probably huddled in their expensive villa by the sea, they had no idea what I had discovered in their own carefully hidden past. The sun was setting over the Caribbean Sea, painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and pink. The wind from the ocean carried a faint scent of salt and jasmine to my penthouse. Somewhere in one of our other resorts, in a securely locked safe, there was a USB drive containing information that would make today's disclosure look like a minor scandal. The Gaspard family has spent generations building a reputation for itself as an old aristocracy, people whose lineage went back centuries, to noble and noble ancestors. I smiled, thinking of the document I'd found in my father's old files. It's time to show them what real power looks like, not the one that was bought with stolen money and fake titles, but the one that was built with honest work and decency. But first I had to plan a wedding. Not mine, not anymore. But it would certainly be an event that no one will ever forget. The morning after the humiliating departure of Gaspard and his mother, I sat in my home office, looking through the files that Sarah had collected. Each page revealed another layer of deception that turned my stomach. The carefully constructed facade of the Lancaster family was beginning to crack, and what lay beneath it was uglier than I had imagined. A knock on the door distracted me from my thoughts. Sarah peered inside, holding her phone in her hands. "Your father's old partner is in touch," she announced. "Nestor Bazzotti. He says it's urgent." I froze when I heard that name. I haven't heard from Nestor in years. Once upon a time, he was not just my father's business partner, they were best friends until a quarrel broke them apart. I picked up the phone, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was pounding in my chest. "Mimi," a low, slightly hoarse voice came over the speaker. He brought back memories of childhood, of summer barbecues and business meetings at our old kitchen table. "I heard about what happened at the resort. It's time for you to find out the truth about Gaspard's family." For the next hour, I listened to Nestor unravel a story that made me hold my breath. The Lancaster family tree, their so-called noble blood, all this was a lie built on fraud and betrayal. 3 generations ago, their family was nothing, just adventurers who married rich heiresses, slowly draining their families of wealth, destroying them, and then moving on to the next victim. My father realized this back when he was starting to build his empire. He was going to expose them, but they were dangerous, Mimi. Nestor's voice sounded hollow. They had connections. Very influential connections. I clenched my hand into a fist, remembering how many years ago my father died in a car accident. At that time, I was told that it was an accident. But was it? "You mean he was murdered?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was silence on the other end of the line. "I can't prove it," he finally said. "But your father was close to exposing them. He had gathered enough evidence to destroy their family once and for all. And then the brakes failed in his car. It was too convenient. I closed my eyes, trying to control the storm raging inside me, a mixture of rage, bitterness, and piercing regret. Years of lies, intrigues, and a carefully staged performance all came crashing down on me like an avalanche, making me realize how cleverly I had been tricked. "Why didn't you tell me that when I married Gaspard?" I asked, trying my best to keep my voice steady. "Your father made me promise that I would let you live your life. He hoped that Gaspard would be different." Nestor sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, Mimi. I should have warned you." I ran a hand over my face, trying to collect my thoughts. But it wasn't really necessary anymore. I knew what to do next. I got up, went to the safe hidden behind the painting, and took out a small worn leather magazine. It contained my father's notes, all his notes, details of transactions, information about how he built an empire. And most importantly, the evidence he was gathering against the Lancasters. "Nestor, I have documents. The full report. Evidence of their scams." I heard him inhale sharply. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I found my father's old encrypted disk. There's a paper trail of their crimes on it. I won't just expose them, Nestor. I will destroy them." He was silent for a long time. "Then do it right, Mimi. Make sure that not even a trace of them remains." After hanging up, I called Sarah into my office, and when she came in, I quickly and clearly formulated a task that might have seemed strange to her, but for me it had already acquired a clear outline in my head. "I need you to contact every bride who has booked our resorts for next year. Offer them a significant improvement in conditions, transfer them to our other facilities, and make them happy." Sarah frowned, tilting her head slightly, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but she nodded without asking unnecessary questions. "Leave the main resort empty for the spring?" she clarified. "For the wedding," I added, smiling weakly, knowing that the word would raise even more questions. Sarah raised an eyebrow, not hiding her skepticism. "Whose wedding?" "The Lancasters," I replied calmly and held her gaze. I saw her tense up, but before she could voice her doubts out loud, I continued. "Don't worry. I want to give them exactly what they want, a grand stage for their perfect wedding in high society, with the most influential guests, with the glitter they love so much." Sarah finally understood what was behind my words. "And then?" "What is it?" she asked, and the corners of my lips turned up in a grim smile. "Then they'll get what they really deserve." Later that day, an unexpected visitor came to me. Caprice, Ricardo's younger sister, stood at my doorstep, nervously clasping her hands, but there was more determination than fear in her gaze. "I know what my sister and Gaspard are doing," she blurted out as soon as she stepped through the door. "And I know what happened to the Palladini family last year. And with the Blackwoods before that." I studied her carefully, taking my time with the answer, letting her speak. "It's their template," she continued, and there was obvious pain in her voice. "Find someone rich, marry them, destroy them. And I can't. I can't let them do this again." I crossed my arms over my chest, not taking my eyes off her. "Why are you telling me this?" Caprice nervously licked her lips and took a step closer, as if she was afraid that someone would overhear our conversation. "Because you're different," she replied with sudden sincerity. "You're the first one to resist." She took out her phone, and I noticed that her fingers were shaking slightly. "I have recordings of conversations between Gaspard and Justina." She hesitated, as if she wasn't sure if she should say the next words out loud. "They're planning something worse than just abandoning you." My chest tightened. "What is it?" Caprice took a deep breath and activated the recording. I listened, and a chill ran down my spine. Gaspard's voice, the same voice that had once whispered words of love in my ear, was hard, calculating, without a single note of emotion. He wasn't just going to divorce me. He planned to destroy me. The documents he was going to forge were supposed to expose me as guilty of financial fraud. They wanted to use the doctor's signatures to make it look like I was embezzling money from my own company. The plan was thought out to the smallest detail. When the last recording ended, I closed my eyes, trying to suppress my rage, but I realized that I no longer wanted to hide it. "Thanks, Caprice," I said, opening my eyes. "This changes everything." That evening, watching the sunset from my office window, I received another message. This time from an unknown number. "Be careful. They've done this before, and their last victim didn't live to tell the story." I stared at the screen, and my blood suddenly froze in my veins. It wasn't just about saving my family's legacy. It was about survival. The next day, the Blue Room was empty, as I had planned. I ordered the restaurant to be cleared of other guests, leaving only the necessary staff, people who had worked for our family for years and whom I could trust. Gaspard arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. He was wearing a navy blue suit that I gave him for our last anniversary. The irony did not escape me. "Mimi," he said, smiling the same smile that once made my heart flutter. Now she caused only a cold, almost clinical disgust. "You look beautiful." I chose my outfit carefully. A simple black dress that belonged to my mother seemed to me the only right choice for this evening. It symbolized a true family history, unlike everything that was built on the lies in which Gaspard lived. I gestured at the table. "Sit down." He sat down across from me, never taking his eyes off me. Gaspard tensed, his fingers gripping the stem of the glass with such force that for a moment I thought the fragile glass would shatter under the pressure. He took a deep breath, forcing a strained, almost good-natured smile on his face, but there was no longer the same confidence in his eyes with which he entered the Blue Room. "Let's skip the pleasantries," I said, casually crossing my legs and putting my hands on the table. "We both know why we're here." Gaspard did not immediately respond, allowing the waiter to fill our glass with expensive wine, which, as I knew very well, he ordered from my supplier. He leaned back in his chair, feigning lazy nonchalance, but I could see his mind racing in search of a way out of the situation. "This whole situation is out of control," he said finally, in an insinuating tone that seemed to have echoes of the old Gaspard, the one I once loved. "You've always been emotional, darling, but this is your dramatic outburst. It's beneath you." I remembered Caprice's notes, her trembling fingers clutching the phone, Nestor's warnings about a suspicious accident with my father, the nights when I flipped through financial reports, trying to figure out exactly where they were trying to frame me. My hand tightened on the glass of water, but my voice remained steady. "Tell me about the Palladini family." A slight twitch of his left eye is the only sign that I've taken him by surprise. "I do not know what you mean." "Elizabeth Palladini," I continued, not taking my eyes off him, "inherited a luxury hotel chain from her father at the age of 32. She married a charming man named Nestor Lancaster. Your uncle. Within a year, she had lost everything. And 3 months after the court ruled on the transfer of the last property to the Lancasters, her car was found at the foot of a cliff." Gaspard shrugged his shoulders, making a vague gesture with his hand. "It's an ancient family history," he said with exaggerated nonchalance, but I noticed his knuckles whiten on the wine glass. "And this has absolutely nothing to do with us." "Then let's talk about something more recent," I suggested, taking a sip of water. "For example, about the marriage contract, which my mother's lawyers are trying to invalidate. Or about the documents you're forging to frame me for embezzlement." This time, he couldn't hide his shock. There was a moment of silence between us, broken only by the muffled music of the restaurant. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw the real Gaspard. Cold, calculating, suddenly very dangerous. "You've been busy," he said softly. "But you're playing a game you don't understand, Mimi. Some things are better left alone. Like my dad's accident." The words hung in the air between us like a fragile thread stretched to its limit. Gaspard sipped his wine slowly, studying me over the rim of his glass. Accidents happened all the time, he said finally. Especially at the construction site. Your father knew about the risks. He knew other things, too. I leaned forward, watching his eyes narrow slightly. For example, about the real Lancasters. He didn't say anything, but his fingers twitched slightly. I took an old photograph out of my purse, yellowed at the edges, and put it in front of him. It showed a group of people standing in front of a large mansion. Your grandfather is not in this picture, Gaspard, I said quietly. But there is a real Charles Lancaster. He looked up sharply. This is nonsense. It's a fact. I tilted my head to the side, watching his cockiness crack. After the fire, in which, fortunately for him, the entire Lancaster family died, the man you called your grandfather took the place of the real Charles. What makes you think that? My father was meticulous in his research, I replied calmly. He believed in knowing who he was dealing with. I fell silent, letting my words sink into his mind. He also believed in backups, I added after a pause. Many of which are hidden in places where your family would never have thought to look. The waiter came over with our snacks, but Gaspard didn't even look at the food. His gaze was fixed on the photo, his face remained impassive, but I could see him trying to assess the situation, find a loophole, turn the game in his favor. What do you want? What is it? He finally asked. I smiled. I want you to understand something. I pulled out my phone and turned on a short audio clip. Gaspard's voice came over the speaker, his own voice, coolly discussing plans to frame me for financial crimes. He turned pale. And this is just an example, I added, turning off the recording. He was silent. I leaned closer, letting my smile turn as cold as ice. I have proof of all this, Gaspard. Every document you forged. Every lie you've told. Every plan that you and Justine have come up with. It's all securely locked. And if anything happens to me... I took a dramatic pause. Everything will become public knowledge. Gaspard clenched his jaw. You're bluffing. But there was no longer any confidence in his voice. I took out my phone and turned on a short audio clip. His own voice, clear, confident, almost lazily dismissive, rang out in the silence of the Blue Room, discussing plans to frame me for financial crimes. I watched as his face paled for a moment, as the corners of his lips twitched, as if he was trying to restrain a nervous tic, as his fingers, which had been lying calmly on the snow-white tablecloth, tightened, digging into the expensive fabric of his jacket sleeves. And this is just an example, I said calmly, stopping the recording and putting the phone on the table between us, as if inviting him to realize the inevitable. Gaspard slowly leaned back in his chair, his dark, watchful eyes darted to the side, and then returned to me. He tried to maintain a mask of indifference, but I could see that his calmness was just an illusion. You don't have anything that can stand up in court, he said at last, but there wasn't the confidence in his voice that I was used to. I have enough to attract the attention of the press, investors, and most importantly, the police, I replied, leaning forward. I have a few more hours of notes. Your mother's involvement. The role of Ricardo. Everything that you and Justina had planned. I let him digest what I said before continuing, savoring every word. So that's what's going to happen, Gaspard. You will sign the divorce papers that my lawyers have prepared. You will take your mother and Justina and leave. Not just from the resort. From the country. Forever. Or I'll finish what my father started. Every scam, every identity stolen, every suspicious death, it's all going to come out. How long do you think your noble family will last when the truth comes out? His gaze darkened, and there was pure, unbridled hatred in it. You don't know what you're doing, he hissed, clutching the wine glass so tightly that I half expected to hear the glass shatter. There are people involved who will not hesitate. Another accident? I smiled coldly, cocking my head to the side. Do you really think I didn't take precautions? At that moment, my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen. A message from Sarah, "Everything is ready there." I stood up, smoothing my dress, and watched with pleasure as his gaze involuntarily darted up, following my every move. "And one more thing," I added, turning to him one last time. "Look out the window." Gaspard frowned, but still turned his head. Down in the parking lot, police cars were slowly pulling up without their headlights on. I watched the officers take up positions around the building, their silhouettes almost invisible in the soft glow of the night lights. "The insurance company," I explained when he stared at me again. "Plus, the police are very interested in some recently discovered evidence regarding Elizabeth Palladini's death." I paused, enjoying the look on his face. "Your uncle might have hushed it up then, but, alas, forensic examination has come a long way since those days." Gaspard inhaled sharply, his hands clenched into fists. I leaned a little closer, making him hear every word. "No, Gaspard. I am a businesswoman. You just didn't notice." I started to leave, but as I reached the door, I looked back. "Oh, and the wedding that you and Justina planned so carefully? Don't worry, the venue is still yours. In fact, I even insist. I have something very special planned for this occasion." I didn't expect an answer. I left the blue room without turning around, but I still heard him call my name. I ignored it. Let him guess, let him be tormented by fear, let him not know what exactly I'm up to. Because the truth was, I was just getting started. I barely slept that night. Adrenaline was surging through my blood, preventing my mind from relaxing, forcing me to replay the events of the evening over and over in my head. Every expression on Gaspard's face, every reaction, every threat hidden behind the soft intonation, all this gave me no peace. I was sitting in my home office, illuminated only by the soft glow of a desk lamp, and watching the CCTV footage from the blue room. Something about his reaction to my mentioning Elizabeth Palladini bothered me. Suddenly, the bell rang. I pressed the intercom button. "Miss Conti," my secretary's voice said, "Detective Guido is here. I've been waiting for this visit." The detective came into my office, tired but focused, her movements precise and precise. She had been investigating unsolved cases of suspicious accidents in wealthy families for a long time. When I contacted her department and provided evidence on Elizabeth Palladini's death, she jumped at the opportunity to reopen the case. "The recording from the dinner is quite interesting," she said, sitting down in an armchair. "But I was more interested in what we found in Elizabeth Palladini's car." I leaned forward. Guido opened the tablet and turned its screen towards me. "The same type of damage to the brake line as your father's car. It's too similar to be a coincidence." I felt like everything was getting cold inside. "Can you prove that this was done intentionally?" "Not yet." The detective swiped her finger across the screen, opening new photos. "But we have traces of a chemical substance that was not available at the time of the initial investigation. It proves that the brake lines were deliberately cut." My throat tightened. "And you can connect it with Gaspard?" The detective hesitated, but then her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, and the color drained from her face instantly. "What happened?" I asked, straining to gauge her reaction. Guido looked up. "Mrs. Conti, we need to get you to a safe place immediately." I froze. "Why?" She took a deep breath before answering. "Gaspard's uncle, Nestor Lancaster. He just escaped from house arrest. And last night he was seen in the company of your mother-in-law." A chill ran down my spine. Nestor Bazzotti's warnings about dangerous relationships suddenly seemed too real to me, as if the dusty pages of old archives that I had been casually flipping through suddenly came to life, exuding the smell of ancient conspiracies and shady deals. A few hours later, I was placed in a secure room in one of my other houses, a place that only a few people knew about, surrounded by heavy security, with a camera system and an alarm system set up so that even a fly could not enter unnoticed. Sarah took control of all the operations of the resort, making sure that they continued smoothly in my absence, but despite this, I still felt disconnected from what was happening, as if the shadow of an impending storm hung over me, and the premonition of disaster bound my nerves with steel chains. The phone rang, and I jumped, not immediately recognizing the number. It was Caprice, Ricardo's sister, with whom we rarely spoke, but her voice, full of tension and unconscious fear, made me instantly alert. "Mimi. Thank God you're safe." She spoke quickly, as if she was afraid that the connection was about to break. They were planning something. I overheard Justine talking to Gaspard's mother. They were discussing some kind of backup plan. I straightened up, clutching the phone tighter. "Which one? What did you hear?" "I'm not sure," but there was doubt in her voice, followed by a hasty explanation. "They mentioned the opening of resorts next month. And also, the annual gala." "The gala. The biggest event of the year." I felt the blood rush to my temples. "Governor," I whispered. The governor always attended the gala. It was one of the few informal receptions where the entire elite gathered: politicians, businessmen, investors, public figures. "Yes," Caprice confirmed. "But that's not all. I found some old photos in my parents' attic. Photos of my father with Uncle Gaspard. They're in their 20s, maybe a little over." I frowned. "Do you think it's important?" "I think that my sister's connection with Gaspard was not accidental. I think our families have been working together for generations." The puzzle, which had previously been missing several key elements, finally began to take shape into a clear, terrifying picture. It wasn't just a scam for money or control of resorts. They were after something much bigger: political connections, social influence, power that went beyond mere wealth. I grabbed my laptop, opened the list of confirmed guests at the gala, and ran my eyes over the names. Among them were 3 senators, 2 billionaires from the technology sector, several high-ranking officials, and dozens of other influential people, an ideal hunting ground for scammers specializing in infiltrating rich families. "Caprice, I need these photos. Immediately." "And that's all you remember about the conversations between your parents and the Lancasters?" "Good. I'll send them right away. But be careful, Mimi, they know you're interfering." When I hung up, Sarah burst into the room, her face tense and her eyes alight with anxious excitement. "Mimi, you need to see this." She handed me a tablet with a news article open on the screen. I glanced at the headline, and my blood froze in my veins. "There are questions about the Conti Resort. Empire Origins documents indicate illegal activities." I slowly lowered the tablet onto the table and clenched my fingers into fists. They acted faster than I expected, having already launched their smear campaign, but at the same time they made one fatal mistake. The documents they leaked contained too many details known only to those who were directly involved in Elizabeth Palladini's death. I immediately dialed Detective Guido's number. "How quickly can I get a warrant?" "A warrant? What is it?" she asked, clearly taken aback. "I know where the evidence is," I said, not wasting time on introductions. "Evidence of who killed Elizabeth Palladini." There was a short pause, during which I could almost hear the pieces of the puzzle forming in her head. "Where?" "In the same place where they keep the evidence of all the other crimes they've committed." "You mean?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Yes. They keep the trophies." There was a deep breath on the other end of the line, then silence. "Lancaster Manor," she finally said. "Was he not checked?" "Never," she admitted. "Their influence is too great." It was. "It's weakened now," I said firmly. "It's time to strike." I ended the conversation and turned to Sarah. Contact all the media outlets that published this article. Tell them I'm giving an exclusive interview tomorrow." She nodded, but her eyes remained worried. "And what about the gala?" I smiled, even though I was seething with rage. "Oh, the gala will definitely take place." I opened the seating plan on my laptop and swiped my finger across the screen, finding the names I needed. "Let's make sure the Lancasters and Ricardo's family get the best seats in the house." I poked at the plan, choosing the center tables, right where everyone can see them. As night fell, I stood at the window of my secure room, watching the twinkling lights of the city scatter across the horizon like countless shards of glass reflecting other people's destinies. Tomorrow I would begin to dismantle the carefully constructed world of lies that the Lancasters had created for generations, but today I still had one more unfinished task, one more step that was supposed to become part of the mosaic of my triumph. I slowly ran my fingers over the cold screen of my phone, dialing the number I knew by heart, but which I had never dared to dial. The beeps dragged on for an agonizingly long time, until finally, a familiar voice came from the other side, but it had changed over the years. "Hi," she said softly, almost doubtfully, as if she didn't believe it was really me. "Elizabeth," I replied, clutching the phone until my knuckles turned white. "I think it's time for you to come out of hiding. There's a story that needs to be told, and you're the only one who can tell it." I heard her inhale sharply, froze, digesting my words. How many years has it been since she was forced to disappear? How many nights had she spent hiding in fear? But now she had a chance, and we both had a chance to make sure that the truth finally came to light. "All the pieces will fall into place," I added, softening my voice a little. "Soon. Very soon." The silence on the other end lasted only a moment, but it was enough to know that she agreed. This time, justice will prevail. Not just for me, but for everyone the Lancasters have ever deceived, destroyed, used, abandoned. But first I had to plan the gala, and this time I wanted to make sure it would be an event that no one would ever forget. I was sitting in my private office, surrounded by the dim light of the early morning, slowly flipping through the documents that Elizabeth Palladini had sent me last night. After she faked her death and escaped from the power of her husband, Uncle Gaspard, she spent years collecting evidence against the Lancaster family, evidence that will now become a deadly weapon in the destruction of their criminal empire. 5 minutes until the start of the live broadcast, the producer announced, adjusting my microphone. "I chose this place for an interview for a reason, in my father's old office, which now belonged to me." On the wall behind me were photographs that captured the true story of our family's success, from a small carpentry business to a resort empire. Let everyone see the difference: honest work versus multi-level fraud. And we're live. I raised my head, meeting the attentive gaze of the interviewer. "Mrs. Conti, thank you for agreeing to talk to us today. There have been serious accusations regarding the origin of your family empire. How do you react to this?" I smiled. Confident, restrained, the way a person in full control of the situation would smile. "I'm glad you asked," I said calmly. "Today, I'm not just protecting my family's legacy. Today, I'm exposing a multi-year conspiracy that has affected not only me, but also many other families. For decades, a group of people calling themselves the Lancasters have used lies, manipulation, and criminal schemes to infiltrate the upper strata of society. They changed names, forged documents, and eliminated those who could interfere with them." I paused, letting my words sink in the minds of the audience. "I have proof." Documents that Sarah had already handed over to major news agencies began to appear on the screen behind me. Fake birth certificates, marriage certificates, forged wills, the whole list of scams that the Lancasters used to infiltrate families, destroy them from the inside and appropriate their wealth. "Let's start with their origins," I continued. "The real Lancasters died in a fire almost 50 years ago. They were replaced by a man known as Charles Lancaster, Gaspard's grandfather. In fact, his name was completely different, and he was a professional fraudster who took the name of a deceased childhood friend. Since then, this family, if you can call them that, has built its empire on deception and lies. The interviewer didn't take his eyes off me. Are you saying that you have proof? Of course, I nodded. But I would like to introduce a person who will tell you even more. I turned to the man behind the camera. Elizabeth, please. The audience might not believe me, but when they saw her, the woman who had been thought dead for many years, the woman who had escaped from the Lancasters, they would not be able to turn away. She came forward, tall and frail, but with fire in her eyes. "Hi, Catherine," she said, addressing Gaspert's mother through the camera, whose face, I knew, was paling at that moment in the hall of her luxurious mansion. "Did you really think that I wouldn't keep evidence of what your brother did to me?" The interviewer was speechless. It was a moment that no one could have predicted. "They tried to kill me," Elizabeth continued, "because I found out the truth. They thought that if I disappeared, their secrets would die with me. But I survived. And all these years I've been collecting evidence." She unfolded the folder with the documents, throwing them on the table in front of her. "This is the story of how the Lancasters broke into the lives of rich and powerful people, forced them to trust, and then destroyed, leaving only ruins. I saw it. I got over it. And now it's over." My phone buzzed softly, making me hold my breath for a moment. The message from Detective Guido was short but very clear. "The warrant has been executed. You were right about the Ricardo family home. The evidence vault has been discovered." I kept a neutral expression on my face as Elizabeth continued to speak, but a wave of glee washed over me. For so many years, they had hidden their crimes under the guise of wealth and refined manners, but now their carefully constructed facade was crumbling, exposing the rot that had accumulated over decades. After the interview, Sarah burst into the office, her eyes burning with tension. The story exploded on social media, she breathed, laying out a tablet with news headlines in front of me. Gaspert's mother was arrested while trying to leave the country. Ricardo's parents are also in custody. But she hesitated, and I realized that the good news was over. "But Gaspert and Justina are still at large," I finished for her. Sarah nodded, clutching her phone. "They disappeared immediately after the interview. Apparently, they are preparing to strike back." I nodded slowly, gathering my thoughts. "And what about the gala?" "Everything has been prepared exactly according to your instructions, including special seating arrangements and other preparations," Sarah replied, looking into my eyes. I smiled out of the corner of my lips. "Then we will continue according to the plan." Elizabeth, who had been standing by the window watching the setting sun, said softly, "Your father would be proud. He was trying to expose them, you know. That's why he was killed." I looked down at the papers scattered on the table. Among them were the documents Detective Guido had given me, evidence after evidence, traces of crimes committed by the Lancasters and their henchmen. "I know," I replied, clutching one of the photos in my hands, in which my father was standing next to a man whose face seemed familiar to me, but whose name I couldn't remember. "But he also taught me patience." I looked up at Elizabeth. "The Lancasters thought they had been patiently weaving their web for months, years. And I've been waiting for 5 years. I learned everything about them. I was collecting evidence. She created a network of allies. And now we have waited for their mistake." My phone vibrated again. A message from Caprice. "They took the bait. Justine just told her friend that she is something that will destroy you once and for all." I grinned, imagining how confidently Justina would run into the hall, confident in her triumph, not knowing that this time I was the hunter. "Perfect," I whispered, shifting my gaze to Sarah. "As soon as they appear, we will be able to close this performance." That evening, as I was reviewing the final preparations, a thought struck me. The Lancasters and their allies had spent generations destroying families through marriage, fraud, and financial fraud. How ironic that their downfall would occur during one of these celebrations. But before they could be caught, there was one more detail that needed to be put in order. I picked up the phone and dialed the number. The governor? Yes, I need to change your security measures for the gala. There's something you need to know about some of your guests. The trap was set. Now all that remained was to wait for our honored guests to find themselves in the center of the web. The ballroom of my flagship resort sparkled with thousands of lights reflected in mirrored columns and crystal chandeliers. The atmosphere of the evening was full of elegance and luxury, but for me it was nothing more than a theatrical set. I stood at the top of the marble staircase, watching the guests arrive in their best clothes, sparkling jewelry, and masks of nobility on their faces. Sarah appeared next to me, her thin bracelet tinkling softly as she adjusted the tablet in her hands. "The security team is in position," she said softly. "The governor's people are coordinating with Detective Guido." No sign of Gaspard or Justine yet. I nodded, sliding my palms over the smooth fabric of my navy blue dress, which looked like the ocean at dawn. "They'll show up," I said confidently. The curtain was rising. The show was starting. I just got a message from Caprice. Sarah, without looking up from the tablet screen, quickly added, "Justina is preparing at their family estate. She's in white." Sure. The irony did not escape me. The woman who was behind the destruction of my marriage, who schemed with a smile, destroying other people's lives for her own pleasure, dressed in the color of innocence, like a naive victim of circumstances. But I knew better. The governor arrived with a guard and nodded slightly as he passed me. He was still impressed after I showed him the documents Detective Guido had given me. These papers proved how the land police had been using information received from victims for years to manipulate political decisions, eliminating unwanted people and promoting the right people. He was shocked, but smart enough to realize that today wasn't just another social event. "Is everything in place?" "What is it?" he asked softly when I greeted him with a slight smile. "Just waiting for our honored guests," I replied. The ballroom was gradually filling up. The soft light of the chandeliers was reflected in the mirrors, multiplying with hundreds of reflections. The music of the string quartet created the illusion of lightness and celebration, but under this shell there was intense concentration. I noticed Elizabeth Palladini at the entrance, wearing a silver wig and light, almost invisible makeup. She insisted on being here, wanted to see with her own eyes the family that almost destroyed her life, in the face of inevitable justice. At 9 o'clock sharp, a slight murmur went through the crowd. She was indeed wearing white. The designer dress, the perfection of the cut, every fold was perfect, and yet I could see that there was a shadow on her, an invisible imprint of anxiety. Next to her, no less immaculate, was Gaspard. In a classic tuxedo, with his hair immaculately coiffed, he looked aristocratic to the core, but I knew that behind that elegance there was fear. They stopped at the entrance, hoping, as always, to create a sensation. Perhaps they expected whispers, admiring glances, and light bows. But instead, they were met with indifference. The guests, who had been instructed in advance, continued their conversations, champagne glasses clinking, but no one paid attention to them. It was the worst possible scenario for people whose power lay in manipulation, in controlling public opinion, in playing on the emotions of others. And now they were nothing. I watched them make their way through the crowd and noticed Justina clutching her evening bag too tightly. "She's their trump card," Sarah whispered. According to Caprice, there were documents inside that they believed would destroy me, papers purporting to prove that my father's business was built on fraud. They are confident that by handing them over to the governor, they will be able to turn the situation to their advantage, discredit me and get away with it. "They're heading for him," Sarah whispered again, without taking her eyes off the tablet screen. "Right on schedule," I replied, moving towards him. I intercepted them at the very moment when they reached the governor's group. "Gaspard, Justine, how nice to see you both," I said, and my voice, although it sounded casual, was loud enough to attract the attention of others. Gaspard smiled tightly. It's not a bad meeting you organized. Maybe not for long, though. Justina took a step forward, her smile as sharp as a knife. We thought it was time for everyone to find out the truth, she said with forced lightness, but there was tension in her voice. About how the Conti Empire was built. About where the money really came from. I tilted my head slightly, feigning interest. Really? What a great idea. I turned to the audience, made a light gesture with my hand, and the music stopped. The entire magnificent crowd turned into a statue, all eyes turned to us. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg your attention, I said, and my voice was steady but firm. Many of you have read recent publications about my family's business. I'd like to tell you a real story tonight. I paused, giving them time to tense up, then turned to Justine, whose smile had frozen. The story of not only the Conti family, but also the Lancasters. Gaspard abruptly moved, trying to grab my arm, but two guards, as if materializing out of thin air, blocked his path. You see, I continued, pausing, this evening is not just a celebration. This is the end and the beginning. I nodded to Sarah. Screens lit up on the walls of the hall, which had been hidden until that moment. Let me show you exactly what I mean. The screens came to life, flashing with a series of images, documents, bank statements, photographs, traces of decades of crimes that the Lancasters tried so hard to hide. However, that wasn't the most devastating piece of evidence. The video that started playing made the air in the hall freeze, as if before a storm. Ricardo's father, filmed with a hidden camera just a few hours ago, spoke with Detective Guido. His voice sounded hollow, but there was no shadow of doubt in it, only the weariness of a man carrying too heavy a burden. He confessed everything. No, Justine whispered, her face pale, her lips trembling. That's not true. She took a step back, disbelief in her eyes, but I could see the fear lurking in the depths. Oh, it's him, I said softly, holding her gaze. Your father was very accommodating once we found the secret room in your manor. A tense silence reigned in the hall, broken only by the soft splashes of breath from the stunned guests. The room, I continued, without taking my eyes off her, where the trophies of every family you destroyed were kept. Including my father's gap line. Justine clutched her bag convulsively, her fingers white with tension. Gaspard took a sharp step forward, but before he could reach me, the governor's security team moved with impeccable coordination, intercepting him before he could close the distance between us by even an inch. Detective Guido stepped out of the crowd. A badge glittered in his hand. Gaspard Lancaster, or should I say, Gaspard Whitmore, his voice was full of cold determination. You're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, complicity in murder, and an impressive list of other charges that we'll discuss at the station. The guards grabbed his arms tightly, not giving him the slightest chance to resist. Justina, who had been proud and confident of her superiority a moment ago, now looked like a porcelain doll, suddenly realizing that she was about to be smashed on the stone floor. When they were taken away, I felt no triumph, no relief, or even joy. Only a deep, emotionless sense of justice finally triumphed. There were worried whispers and exclamations of surprise from the crowd, but I could hear them as if through cotton wool. My attention was drawn to the screen, where an old photo of my father was frozen. His face, so kind, with that smile that once seemed to me the most reliable protection from the world, looked at me from the past. He built this empire with honest work, with a real vision, and not the dirty methods used by the Lancasters. But the night wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. I felt movement nearby. I looked back and saw Elizabeth Palladini. In her hands was a battered leather briefcase. I had never seen him before, but for some reason I immediately realized inside that he was important. Her fingers trembled as she held it out to me. Your father gave it to me for safekeeping, she said softly, her voice filled with something akin to sadness. He made me promise that I would give it to you only after the Lancasters were exposed. I looked at her, feeling a strange excitement building up inside. What's in it? Elizabeth took a slow breath, as if gathering her courage. There's something you need to know about your mother. I tensed involuntarily. My mother died when I was too young to remember her. Elizabeth nodded, but I saw something strange in her eyes, something that sent a chill down my spine. Or, that's what they told you. My fingers tightened on the briefcase, but I didn't dare open it yet. What do you mean? She looked around, assessing the noisy crowd still discussing what had happened. This is not the place, she said softly. Come with me. I nodded silently, and we slipped into my private office. Sarah and Detective Guido were already waiting for us there. There was something like alarm on his face. We found something else at the Bennett house, he said, putting his laptop on the table. I put my briefcase next to it, but my eyes were glued to its screen. Guido opened the file. Something about an accident with your mother. I inhaled slowly. My hands were shaking when I finally decided to open the briefcase. Inside, dozens of emails. I carefully pulled one out and unwrapped it. The handwriting was elegant, neat, almost old-fashioned. I knew him. It belonged to my mother. But they were dated after her death. I felt like something was collapsing inside, losing the ground under my feet. She's alive, I gasped, hardly believing my own words. Elizabeth seemed to understand my shock, but her voice remained steady. She worked with your father to expose the Lancasters. She discovered their connection to several suspicious deaths of prominent families. But when they realized that she was investigating them, they threatened her. Guido nodded slowly. They threatened to kill you and your father if she didn't disappear. That's why she faked her death. I sank into a chair, my fingers trembling as I sorted through the letters scattered on the table, evidence of the life I was not allowed to live next to my mother, secrets that my father carried in his heart until his death. Every word, every line was a cry from the past, an echo of unspoken confessions, belated warnings, and the endless love that he tried to protect from me even after his death. Dad knew he had to keep up the deception to keep you both safe. Elizabeth's voice was soft, almost apologetic, but there was that indomitable strength in it that I was beginning to discern in her words. But he never stopped working to catch the people who took her away from you. I looked up at her, a question in my eyes, but Elizabeth was already looking at Detective Guido. That's why they killed him when he got too close. Sarah stepped forward, a tablet in her hand, the screen of which glowed dimly in the dimness of the office. There's more evidence that we found tonight, she said, swiping her finger across the screen. They go beyond the Lancasters and the Bennetts. We are dealing with a whole network of families involved in similar schemes across the country. I slowly straightened up, clenching my hands into fists. I repeated, hardly believing the scale of what was happening. Your mother helped the other victims escape, Sarah continued, her voice strained but filled with admiration. She was collecting evidence, building cases against these people. All these years, she wasn't just hiding, she was fighting. My mind feverishly searched my memory for small details from childhood, mysterious phone calls that my father made behind the closed doors of his office, sudden trips, the reasons for which he never explained, his lessons, always to have a backup plan, always to be one step ahead. He knew. He knew all along. Where is she now? My voice trembled, barely audible, but there was an unyielding determination in it. Detective Guido typed something on her laptop, then turned it towards me. And here she is. A woman appeared on the screen, older than in the photos, but there was no doubt in her face, only strength, courage, and endless love, reflected in the warm gaze with which she looked at me. Mimi. Her voice was quiet, but I could hear every note, every emotion hidden behind that short word. My brave, brilliant girl. I couldn't breathe. I've been watching you from afar all these years, watching you become such an amazing woman. Her lips twitched into a slight smile. I've never stopped loving you. I've never stopped hoping for this day. Hot tears flowed down my cheeks as I raised my hand, touching the screen, as if trying to touch her through the distance, through the years of separation. Mom. I have so many questions. And I'll answer every one of them, she promised. I could hear the warmth and determination in her voice, and I still felt like a little girl who longs to hear a lullaby before going to bed, but instead finds out that the world she lived in was made up of lies. I'm coming home, Mimi, she said, and her voice pierced me to the very heart. Now that everything is safe, now that you've finished what your father and I started. I'm going home. My chest tightened with emotion, but before I could respond, the office door creaked softly. Sarah opened it, and Caprice appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry to interrupt, her voice was agitated, her eyes anxious. But there's something you need to see. I exhaled slowly, barely looking up from the screen. What happened? Caprice looked at me, assessing my condition, then continued. She left something in her cell phone, and the police just found it. I frowned. Video recognition? Caprice shook her head. But not about what we expected. It's about another family. My heart sank with anticipation. What do you mean? They were stalking someone at the gala tonight. I tensed up. Who exactly? Caprice's answer made me stop. It wasn't just another rich family in danger. I took a deep breath. It's much more than that, Mimi. Her voice became very quiet, but there was uncertainty mixed with anxiety in it. Something that could change everything we thought we knew about Lancaster's operation. My heart started beating faster. Where are they? Caprice took a quick glance at the tablet screen. Somewhere in a crowded ballroom. I clenched my teeth. Their next victim. Dancing, Caprice said, and her eyes met mine. I didn't need to hear the rest. Someone in this room, amid the laughter, music, camera flashes, and the whispers of the guests, did not even suspect how close they were to destruction. The video on Ricardo's phone showed their next target with brutal clarity. On the screen, flooded with soft golden light reflected from crystal chandeliers, a young woman in a light blue dress danced gracefully. Her movements were light and graceful, as if she were floating above the parquet floor. Her laughter shimmered in the air, filling the hall with notes of carefree joy. Amanda Brown is the heiress of a huge hotel empire, a woman who did not even suspect that tonight her life could be cut short or forever changed by someone else's carefully planned will. They didn't choose her by chance, Caprice said, her voice flat, but I could feel the tension in it. The Brown family owns some of the most prestigious hotels in Asia. Their influence extends far beyond the continent. If the Lancasters could gain control of the network, it would be their biggest victory. I watched Amanda laughing with friends, her smile open, sincere, unaware of the shadows hidden behind it. But they played an even longer game than we thought, Caprice continued, looking at me. It was just a preparation, a trial step. I felt a chill run down my spine as she brought up the next entry. Ricardo's younger brother has been getting close to her for months. He made sure that their paths supposedly accidentally crossed on vacation in Europe. They ended up at the same events, in the same companies. Tonight was supposed to be their official introduction, the very moment that would launch their entire plan. I remembered how Gaspard had come into my life, a carefully thought-out introduction, a perfect mask hiding a monster. The Lancasters didn't just use force and threats. They built a web into which they dragged their victims so skillfully that they didn't even realize how deep they had gone. Where is he now? I asked, my voice flat, but rage was bubbling inside me. The police detained him at the airport. Detective Guido, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. He tried to leave the country, but we already had enough evidence to stop him. I saw pictures of his luggage on the screen, documents that looked like a neatly assembled dossier on Amanda and her family, their financial statements, hotel security schemes, personal preferences, even records of her father's health problems. They weren't just planning a rapprochement, I said slowly, scrolling through the pages. They wanted complete control. I turned my gaze to Amanda, still dancing serenely in the center of the room. We need to warn her. It's already been done, Detective Guido nodded. Her father's guards are already aware. They are providing security and will move the whole family to another place. I watched as two men dressed in formal suits approached Amanda unnoticed. She didn't suspect anything. She just nodded, smiled at her friends, tilted her head slightly gracefully and headed for the exit. Her gait remained as light. Her face did not express alarm. Her world did not collapse that night, because we had time. I allowed myself a short sigh of relief. It was only now that I realized that I had been clutching the letter in my hands all this time. A letter written by the hand of the person I loved most in the world. A letter from my father. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. The sheets of paper covered with his neat handwriting were covered with slightly faded ink, and when I scanned the first lines, time seemed to stop. My dear Mimi. If you're reading this, then you've done what your mother and I couldn't do. You've revealed the truth about the Lancasters. I know the price was high. I know that you've had to go through the pain of betrayal, years of doubt and loneliness. If I had a choice, would have spared you all of this. But I always knew, you're stronger than you think. Just like your mother. There's a steel rod under your tender heart. That's why I left you in our resort empire without telling you the whole truth. I knew that if Gaspard turned out to be different from his family, you might find happiness with him. And if he turns out to be the same, you'll be strong enough to see the truth and fight it. Your mother didn't die in that accident, Mimi. She chose to disappear to protect us. Every important business decision I made, every new resort we opened, it was all part of one big plan. I was creating a network. A safety net for people like you. For people like your mother. Every hotel, every casino, every resort villa, all this was not just a business. Hidden behind each facade is a protocol known only to a select few employees. Security protocol. Rescue protocol. Your mother has been running this from the shadows all these years. Now it's time for both of you to come out into the light. I'm sorry that I won't be around to see your reunion. But know one thing, everything I did was out of love for you. You found the evidence. You found allies. They were always there, waiting for you to be ready. Be happy, my dear daughter. Be strong. Be free. All my love. Dad. Tears blurred my vision when I finished reading. My throat tightened with surging emotions, and for a moment it seemed to me that I was a little girl again, hiding in my father's office, waiting for him to return, when his strong, reliable arms would embrace me, when his voice full of love would dispel all fears. But he was gone. All that remains are these lines, steeped in care, faith and endless devotion, left to me as a legacy. Sarah, who was sitting next to me, was silent, letting me live this moment, allowing me to absorb every word, realize its meaning, and feel the full weight and power of this message. When I looked up at her, she silently handed me a napkin, and her gaze was full of understanding, such deep, almost sisterly support that I didn't need words. I accepted her concern, wiped my wet cheeks, and took a deep breath, as if trying to breathe in a new reality, a new destiny that now lay before me. Mrs. Conti's voice broke the silence, and I jerked out of my thoughts. She stood in the doorway, restrained, but with a slight smile that rarely lit up her stern face. "There's someone there who wants to see you," she said. I didn't have to ask who it was. I felt it in my heart. I stood up slowly, my legs suddenly feeling heavy, as if the ground beneath me had acquired a completely different density. Every movement seemed slow, every step seemed infinitely long. I walked through the office, through the hallway, past the twinkling lights of the evening city behind the huge windows, until I stopped at the doorway. And there, illuminated by the soft light of the chandelier, she stood. My mother. Her face was the same as I had seen it in the video call, a little older than in the photos I kept, a little more tired, but still familiar, dear, carved into my memory from childhood. She was real. Incredibly, amazingly real. For a moment, we just stared at each other. 20 years of separation hung between us like something tangible, like a blank wall built by years of pain, loss, and the inability to even hope for this moment. But then she opened her arms. And I, forgetting about everything I had gone through, about all the fears, betrayals, and how strong I had to be for so many years, ran to her like a little girl who had suddenly been given back her world, her home, and her protection. I inhaled her scent, jasmine and something warm, subtly familiar, the smell of childhood, the smell of those nights when she told me stories before going to bed, when her hands gently smoothed my hair, when her voice was the first thing I heard in the morning. "My Mimi," she whispered, holding me tightly, as if afraid to let go, as if intending to hold me in this moment for eternity. "My brave, brilliant girl." Later, when the last guest of the gala had left the hall, when the fuss had subsided, leaving behind only the echoing footsteps of the cleaners in the empty corridors, my mother and I were sitting in my father's old office. Our office now. We flipped through documents, looked at maps, at plans that until recently were just a theory, just a hidden network laid by my father. But now it has become our future. The resort empire will continue. But with a new, much more important goal. We will create a safety net. A secret refuge for those who, like me, have been victims of manipulation, lies, shadow games of powerful families, hidden societies, criminal organizations weaving their networks in the most unexpected corners of the world. Elizabeth Palladini will help us, I said, noting her name on the paperwork. She has resources, connections. She knows who to look for, how to find those in trouble. My mother nodded, running her finger over the cards in approval. Gaspard, Justina, and their entire network will stand trial, I continued, my voice firm, without hesitation. They thought they could control the fate of people, use them as pawns in their game, but now the game is over. Mom looked up at me, her gaze was full of that pride that I had been looking for so long. But their fall is not the end of our story, Mimi, she said softly. This is just the beginning. I looked at the documents, at the photographs of our future, at the drawings of new resorts, which will now be not just symbols of wealth, but quiet islands of safety for those who need protection. Do you think you're ready for this new chapter, Mimi? She asked softly. I looked around. There was a picture of my father on the wall, and his face was serious, but there was something warm and approving in his eyes, as if he knew this moment would come one day. The lights of the resort twinkled outside the window, their light reflected in the waters of the Caribbean Sea, shimmering in hundreds of shades. I looked at the woman next to me, a strong, incredible woman who sacrificed everything to protect me. I thought about all the people we could help. About those who still don't know that there is someone in the world who won't let them fall, who will reach out at the most terrible moment. I thought about the long way I had come, and the price I had paid for this truth. I felt her hand squeeze mine. Yes, I said, meeting her gaze. I'm ready. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Caribbean Sea, softly coloring the sky in pastel shades of hope, and for the first time in many years, I felt like I could breathe deeply. The carpenter's daughter didn't just protect her father's legacy. She turned him into something more than anyone could have imagined. And this time I wasn't standing alone. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.